He wasn't supposed to open that door. Damien Voss had walked through 1,000 doors in his life. Boardrooms, back alleys, hospital corridors where men begged for mercy, and none of them had ever stopped him cold the way this one did. One wrong turn, one unlocked door. And suddenly, the most dangerous man in Chicago was standing completely still, staring at a woman's bare back covered in bruises the color of rotting plums, while the city's most celebrated hero waited downstairs to claim her. If you've been waiting for a story about power, silence, and what happens when the wrong man finally sees the truth, this is it. Watch until the end. Hit that like button. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The elevator doors opened at 7:42 p.m., and Damien Voss stepped onto the 43rd floor like a man who owned the building. Which, technically, he did. He owned the building, the 4 floors above it, and the parking structure across the street. He owned a penthouse in Manhattan, a villa outside of Lyon, and a controlling interest in 17 companies that publicly had nothing to do with each other and privately formed the skeleton of the most quietly powerful criminal enterprise in the Midwest. What Damien Voss did not own, and had spent nearly 11 months trying to convince himself he didn't want, was the attention of Celine Carter, his executive assistant, his employee, the woman who had been engaged to another man for 6 of those 11 months. He straightened his cufflinks in the reflection of the elevator's brushed steel panel, caught himself doing it, and stopped. He was not a man who fidgeted. He had sat across from 3 separate federal investigators in the last 4 years without fidgeting. He had watched a man he'd trusted for a decade get led out of this very building in handcuffs and had held perfectly still while the cameras found his face. Fidgeting was for men with something to hide. Tonight was the Blackwood International Charity Gala, the single biggest fundraising event on the Chicago social calendar, and by extension the single biggest public performance of the year. 260 guests, 12 television cameras, 4 sitting city council members, 1 senator, and a guest of honor who happened to be the fiancé of his executive assistant, Dr. Julian Mercer, founder of the Mercer Children's Foundation, celebrated pediatric surgeon, the face on 3 different hospital fundraising billboards currently visible from Lakeshore Drive. Damien had reviewed the seating chart twice and positioned himself at a table that placed exactly 47 feet between him and Julian Mercer for the duration of the evening. He had a system for managing things he did not like. Distance was part of it. He was heading toward the private prep suite at the end of the corridor because he'd left a folder there, a specific folder with a specific document he needed before the evening's second phase, and because Celine had told him at 6:15 that evening that she was using the adjacent room to change, not the suite itself, and he had processed that information and filed it, and apparently forgotten it in the 22 seconds it took him to reach the door and push it open without knocking. The light was on. He registered that. He registered the soft sound, something between a sharp breath and a caught sob, and the rigid stillness that followed it, and then his eyes adjusted and he saw her. Celine Carter stood with her back to him, her dress halfway up, one arm raised to pull the zipper, and her skin visible from the base of her neck to the waistband of the gown she was trying to get into. She had not yet turned around. She was frozen exactly the way animals freeze when they hear a sound they don't recognize. Not the freeze of embarrassment, but the freeze of something more careful, more conditioned, more practiced. The freeze of someone running a calculation. Damien had been in enough situations to read the difference. He also could not look away from what he was seeing, not because of the visible skin, though in 11 months he had constructed elaborate professional barriers specifically against thinking about that, but because of the bruises. There were 4 of them he could count clearly. One across her left shoulder blade, broad and dark yellow at the edges, old enough to be fading but still present, still a record of something that had happened at least a week ago. 2 more along her right side, below the ribs, the newer kind, the kind that sat at the surface of the skin with that particular angry darkness that meant they were 3 or 4 days old at most. And then the 4th, which was different from the others, long and thin, running diagonally across the left side of her lower back, the kind of mark that didn't come from falling. That kind came from an edge, something flat and solid with a corner. He registered all 4 bruises in approximately 2 seconds. His hand was still on the door. "Get out." Her voice was flat and even, directed at the wall in front of her. He should have, By every reasonable measure of professional conduct, social decency, and the basic human instinct to retreat from a situation that was none of his business, he absolutely should have backed out, pulled the door shut, and pretended the last 8 seconds had not happened. He was Damien Voss. He was 41 years old, he had built an empire on controlled restraint, and he had maintained a professional relationship with this woman for 11 months without a single crack in the perimeter. He took one step into the room instead. "I'll need a minute," he said. "You'll need to leave. Celine." "Mr. Voss." She still hadn't turned. Her arm was lowered now, the zipper of her dress held loosely in her hand, the gown bunched at her waist. Her spine was absolutely rigid. "This is not an appropriate— Who hit you?" The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. He'd heard silences like that before, in interrogations, in negotiations, in hospital waiting rooms where someone was deciding how much truth the moment could bear. This one stretched for 4 full seconds, and in those 4 seconds he watched the muscles along her back tighten one by one, watched her shoulders go up a fraction of an inch, watched her make a decision. "I fell." "You fell." "Down the stairs, at home, last Tuesday." She said it the way people say things they've said before, not reciting exactly, but falling into the rhythm of it, the well-worn groove of a practiced explanation. "It happens. It happens 4 separate times in different locations across your back. I'd like you to leave my room." "It's not your room, it's the company prep suite. And I came to get a document." He didn't move toward the document. He stood at the door with his hand still on the frame, watching her not turn around. "I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth." "I did tell you the truth." "You told me a story. There's a difference." She turned around then. He'd prepared himself for this, or thought he had, because he had in fact spent 11 months preparing various mental contingencies for the possibility that the careful professional distance might collapse at some inopportune moment. But what he hadn't prepared for was her face. She had her expression locked down, the way she always did, that particular arrangement of control she maintained in every meeting and every difficult phone call and every moment when his temper pushed at the edges of what a reasonable employer could demand. But her eyes were doing something her face wasn't. They were measuring him. "If you came for the Harrington document," she said, "it's in the gray folder on the side table." He looked at the side table. The gray folder was there. He looked back at her. "Zip your dress," he said quietly. "We'll talk after." "There's nothing to talk about." "Celine." He kept his voice even, kept it out of the register where it normally lived when he was issuing instructions that didn't get questioned. This was different. Even he knew it was different. "Zip your dress. I'll get the folder, and then you're going to sit down for 5 minutes before we go downstairs." She stared at him for another moment with that measuring look, and then she turned back to the mirror and reached for the zipper. He crossed to the side table, picked up the gray folder without opening it, and positioned himself on the far side of the room with his back to her reflection. He heard the quiet sound of the zipper, the soft adjustment of fabric, the precise, controlled exhale of a woman pulling herself back into the armor she wore every day. "Done," she said. He turned around. She looked immaculate. That was the word for it. Immaculate. The way only someone with a great deal of practice at surface-level perfection can manage in a small room under bad lighting in under 60 seconds. The green gown covered everything. Her hair was already up. Her expression had been reset to the professional neutrality he'd come to recognize as her default setting, the one that revealed almost nothing and deflected almost everything. Almost. "Sit down," he said. "We have guests arriving." "The guests are already here. Gervais is managing the floor. Sit down." She sat. Not reluctantly, not with visible resentment, but with the quiet precision of someone who recognized an instruction from a position of genuine authority and chose compliance as the path of least resistance. She sat on the edge of the small settee near the window and folded her hands in her lap and waited. And Damien pulled a chair from the prep table, turned it around, and sat across from her with 3 feet of space between them. "How long?" he said. "How long what?" "How long has he been hitting you?" Her jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. "That's an extremely serious accusation about a person you— But I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm asking you a question." He put the gray folder on his knee and kept his hands flat and still. He had learned a long time ago that when you needed someone to tell you something they didn't want to say, the worst thing you could do was lean forward. You stayed still. You gave them room. You don't have to answer, but I need you to understand what I saw, so that when you say, "I fell down the stairs," you're saying it to someone who knows what falling downstairs actually looks like. She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes that he couldn't quite name. "The bruise on your shoulder blade is at least 10 days old," he said. "The ones on your right side are newer. 3 days? Maybe 4? The one on your lower back is from an edge, not a surface. That's not a fall. That's not even close to a fall." He paused. "And you knew immediately to freeze when you heard the door, before you knew who it was." Silence. "Julian is being honored downstairs in 40 minutes, she said. Her voice was completely level. "He's receiving the Harrington Humanitarian Award. There are cameras and reporters and 260 guests who have paid $5,000 a plate specifically because they believe in what he does. I know what's happening downstairs." "Then you know that whatever you think you saw, I know what I saw. Whatever conclusions you're drawing are going to cause damage that cannot be undone." She held his gaze, and now the measurement in her eyes had sharpened into something closer to urgency. "I'm asking you to let this go, tonight, just tonight." Damien studied her for a long moment. He was not a man who felt helpless often. The architecture of his life had been specifically designed to prevent helplessness. The money, the network, the security teams, the lawyers, the understanding he had with certain city officials that made certain problems go away. Helplessness was for people without resources. He had more resources than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, and he was sitting 3 feet away from a woman who was asking him to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen, and he couldn't make himself do it. "All right," he said. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "Tonight," he added. She looked at him. "That's all I'm agreeing to," he said. "Tonight, I'll stay out of it. But this conversation isn't finished." She held his gaze for a beat too long, and then she stood, smoothing the green gown with both hands in that careful, practiced way, and he watched her reconstruct the armor piece by piece. The posture, the expression, the precise angle of her chin that communicated competence and control and absolutely nothing else. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer that. The ballroom of the Blackwood International Tower occupied the entire 38th floor and was designed to be overwhelming. 30-foot ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows that exposed the city skyline in every direction, chandeliers that had cost more individually than most people's cars. Damien had approved the renovation budget 7 years ago without blinking because he understood that spectacle was a language, and he had always been fluent. Tonight the room was at capacity. The low, layered murmur of 260 carefully curated guests rose and fell beneath the sound of a string quartet playing something that cost money just to listen to properly. Waitstaff moved in the specific, coordinated pattern of trained professionals carrying trays of things that were expensive precisely because they were small. Damien stood near the east wall with a glass of water he hadn't touched and watched the room the way he watched every room, with the part of his mind that never fully came off duty, the part that categorized exits and registered anomalies and noticed when someone's body language didn't match their face. He found Celine in under 4 seconds. She was near the center of the room, standing beside Dr. Julian Mercer, who was exactly as Damien had always found him, tall, good-looking in the specific way that photographed well, rather than actually registering as attractive in person, with the kind of easy smile that came from decades of practice and said nothing about the man behind it. Julian had a hand at the small of Celine's back, the light, possessive gesture of a man presenting something he owned, and he was talking to 3 city council members with the fluent, comfortable charisma of someone who had spent years learning to make powerful people feel heard. Damien watched the hand at Celine's back. He watched her hold perfectly still beneath it. He watched the infinitesimal tension in her shoulders, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 11 months reading her body language across conference tables. And he watched the smile she deployed for the council members, the one that reached her eyes at the exact percentage required to register as genuine without crossing into warmth. And he thought about the bruise along her lower back, below the zipper line of the green dress, below the hand Julian was resting there with such casual confidence. "Mr. Voss." Marcus Webb materialized at his left shoulder, head of Blackwood International Security, a broad, quiet man who had worked for Damien for 9 years and who communicated primarily in efficient half-sentences and direct eye contact. "Everything's in position, perimeter's clean. Good. You want me on the room or on the hall?" "Room." Damien took a sip of the water he didn't want. "I want eyes on Dr. Mercer tonight." Marcus processed this without visible reaction. "Personal or professional?" "Does it matter?" "Tells me how close to put the eyes. Close enough to notice if anything changes." Damien set the glass down on a passing waiter's tray. "But subtle. I don't want him to feel watched." "Subtle's my whole job." Marcus moved away. Damien returned his attention to the room. Julian Mercer was laughing now at something the nearest council member had said, the open, generous laugh of a man completely at ease with his own importance. And Celine had turned her head very slightly away, the way you turn your head when a sound is too loud to process comfortably. The gesture lasted a quarter second before she corrected it. No one else in the room would have noticed. Damien noticed. He excused himself from the wall and moved through the room with the particular economy of motion that came from years of practice. Not aggressive, not hurried, but purposeful in a way that meant people parted naturally rather than requiring navigation. He stopped to greet Senator Alcott and said 3 sentences that meant nothing but landed correctly. He spoke briefly to the Harrington Foundation's board chair and confirmed 2 logistical details. He accepted another glass of water he didn't intend to drink and positioned himself at a diagonal across the room from Celine, close enough to observe clearly, far enough to be invisible. Julian's hand had moved from the small of her back to her shoulder. Light grip. Thumb resting against the base of her neck. Celine was smiling at something being said to her right. Damien watched the thumb at the base of her neck and thought about the bruise on her shoulder blade, the old one, the one that was fading yellow at the edges and positioned at an angle consistent with pressure from above, and felt something cold and very specific settle into his chest. He found her alone for 37 seconds at 8:51 p.m. Julian had been pulled toward a cluster of photographers near the presentation stage, and Celine had drifted toward the east windows under the pretense of checking her phone, and Damien crossed the room without announcing himself and positioned himself beside her with his back to the glass. "He's watching us," she said quietly, without looking up from her phone. "I know. Smile at your phone." She adjusted the angle of her expression fractionally. "What are you doing?" "Checking in." "We discussed this." "We discussed tonight. The night isn't over." He kept his gaze on the middle distance, the practiced, unfocused look of a man scanning a room. "Tell me one thing." "Mr. Voss." "One thing. Then I'll go back to my table and finish my water and mind my own business for the rest of the evening." He paused. "What does he have on you?" The silence stretched. He could see her in his peripheral vision. The stillness, the consideration, the internal negotiation of someone deciding whether the risk of honesty was smaller than the risk of continued silence. "My brother," she said. He kept his breathing even. "Ethan. He's 16. He's been on a pediatric cardiac waiting list for 14 months. Her voice was completely flat, the flatness of someone who has drained a thing of all its emotional charge through sheer necessity. Julian controls the prioritization decisions through his foundation. He has relationships with 3 separate board members and the department head who signs off on placement orders. He can move your brother up or down the list. He can remove him from it entirely." She looked up from her phone, not at Damien, but at the middle distance, at the room full of guests and cameras and chandeliers. One phone call, one administrative decision that doesn't even require his direct signature. Ethan disappears from the system as a clerical error, and there's no appeal process that works fast enough to matter. Damien processed this for exactly as long as it took him to understand the full weight of it. "How long?" he said. 2 years, the foundation arrangement. She stopped. Adjusted. The rest of it started 8 months ago. 8 months. He'd hired her 13 months ago. He ran a rapid involuntary calculation across the timeline of the last year, the way she moved around the office, the careful positioning, the slight but consistent preference for standing over sitting, the time she'd come in with her hair arranged to cover her neck, and felt the cold thing in his chest spread slightly outward. "He's aware I've been collecting records," she said. That stopped him. "What kind of records?" "Financial documentation, foundation donor flows, transplant priority adjustments cross-referenced against donation amounts. I've been building it for 7 months." She said it without pride, without drama, just as a statement of fact delivered to a man she had apparently decided deserved the truth. He doesn't know the specifics, but he knows something. He got careful about 3 weeks ago. "Where are the records?" "Encrypted, distributed, nothing local, nothing on a company server." She glanced at him for just a moment, and the look was direct and very clear. "I'm not asking for your help. I know you're not. I'm also not going to ask you to stay out of it." "Good." Across the room, Julian had extricated himself from the photographers and was scanning the crowd with the pleasant, easy expression of a man who had never once in his life looked for someone he didn't immediately locate. "He's going to find you in about 15 seconds, Damien said. "I know. Go back toward the Harrington table. I'll follow in 2 minutes from a different direction." She was already moving. Damien stood at the window for a moment longer, looking at his own reflection in the dark glass with Chicago spread out behind it. The grid of lights, the black line of the lake, the indifferent geometry of the city going about its business. And then he turned and walked back into the room. The Harrington Humanitarian Award presentation began at 9:15. Damien sat at his assigned table and watched the stage with the expression he wore to every public event: present, attentive, revealing nothing, while the board chair gave a 4-minute introduction that used the word transformative 7 times and visionary 4. Julian received the award with the perfect calibration of grateful humility, the slight catch in the voice, the pause to compose himself before speaking, the gesture towards Celine in the audience that the cameras found immediately and broadcast across 3 monitors positioned around the room. Celine smiled. It was a perfect smile, the kind that read as loving and proud from 40 feet and told Damien nothing from 6 years of experience reading her face. Julian spoke for 11 minutes. He spoke about children who had no advocates, about a healthcare system that required champions willing to fight institutional inertia, about the families who trusted him with the most irreplaceable thing they possessed. He was fluent and he was warm and he was exactly as convincing as a man needed to be when 260 people wanted to believe in him. Damien watched Celine's hands in her lap. They were folded, still. The way her hands got when she was managing something internally that she wasn't going to let reach her face. Marcus appeared at his shoulder during the applause, bent slightly, said 2 words directly into Damien's ear. "North Corridor." But the North Corridor was the service passage that ran behind the ballroom's catering stations. Damien found Marcus there with a younger member of the security team, Reyes, tech background, who handled the building's digital infrastructure, and a tablet displaying what appeared to be a screenshotted email chain. "Found it running background on the donor flow you asked me to watch last month," Reyes said, holding out the tablet. "Foundation transfers. This is from a whistleblower archive our external compliance team flagged 6 weeks ago. I didn't connect it to tonight until about an hour ago when I ran the name cross-reference." Damien took the tablet. He read for 90 seconds. What he was looking at was a partial email chain, 8 messages deep, between the administrative director of the Mercer Children's Foundation and a Dr. Alan Bryce, who appeared to be the department coordinator Celine had mentioned, the one who signed off on transplant placement orders. The language was careful, the kind of careful that came from people who knew their words could be evidence, but the structure of it was unmistakable. Specific names, specific amounts. Specific patients moved and patients deferred. "How complete is this?" he said. "This is maybe 20% of what she has," Reyes said. "If I'm reading the architecture right, there's a full encrypted archive somewhere in the hospital's own system, buried in a directory structure that looks like routine administrative backup. Someone put it there with access from inside." Celine. She'd said distributed, nothing local. She'd hidden the evidence inside the institution itself. "Can you get it?" Damien said. Not from here. I'd need either direct network access inside the hospital or the key to whatever she used to encrypt it. Reyes paused. Or someone who knows the file path. Damien handed back the tablet. He thought about the way she'd looked at him at the window, the directness of it. I'm not asking for your help, she'd said, which was exactly what someone said when they'd already been thinking about whether they could ask for help and hadn't yet decided. Keep digging, he said. Don't touch anything, just map it. Yes, sir. He went back into the ballroom. At 9:47 p.m., Julian Mercer was photographed by 4 separate cameras shaking the mayor's hand. At 9:49 p.m., while the photographs were still being taken, he was also watching Celine cross the room toward the bar, and Damien, who was watching Julian, saw his expression shift for approximately 2 seconds into something that was not the face he showed to cameras. It was the face of a man who was checking on something he owned. Celine reached the bar and asked for sparkling water and turned to face the room while she waited, and she did not look in Julian's direction, and she did not look at Damien, and she stood with her weight balanced evenly on both feet, the way people stand when they need to be ready to move quickly, and Damien thought about the bruise on her lower back and the 16-year-old boy waiting on a cardiac list, and 7 months of encrypted evidence hidden in a hospital server. And he crossed to the bar. He did not stand beside her. He stood at the far end, 3 empty spaces away. And when the bartender came to him, he ordered nothing and instead placed his phone on the bar face down with his hand resting over it. Don't look at me, he said, not loud. The music covered it. Yes or no, do you need access to what's on that server? A pause. Yes, she said. If I put a tech team on it tonight, will you give them the path and the key? Another pause. Longer. It'll trigger an alert on his system, she said. He has a flag set. If someone accesses that directory, he'll know. How long does he have before he can act on it? 20 minutes, maybe 30. He'd have to get to a terminal he controls. Damien considered this. 20 minutes was a thin margin. In 20 minutes, with the right team and clear access, you could extract and copy and verify and route through 2 separate secure servers and still have time left over. But it required everything to go right. And in his experience, extraction operations had a way of discovering complications at exactly the wrong moment. There's something else, Celine said quietly. He waited. The file doesn't just show the donor favoritism. She took her sparkling water without looking at the bartender. There are complaint records in there. Hospital staff. 3 nurses and a resident who filed internal grievances in the last 18 months and had their complaints buried by HR. 2 of the complaints were about him specifically. The cold thing in his chest sharpened. About his conduct in the hospital, she continued, and about one incident that happened outside the hospital, at an event, where they saw something and reported it and were told it was a personal matter. He didn't ask what they saw. He was fairly certain he already knew the shape of it. Give me the path, he said. If it goes wrong, it won't. If it does, she said, and her voice was completely flat and absolutely precise. He will move Ethan. Not transfer him, not adjust his placement. He'll flag the case as administratively closed. There's no appeals process that operates fast enough. Ethan has a window of 6 months before the condition progresses past the intervention threshold. Damien picked up his phone from the bar. Give me the path, he said again. She told him. He left the bar without looking at her. In the north corridor, Reyes had the tablet back out before Damien had finished speaking. That's a tertiary backup node, Reyes said, pulling up the hospital's documented server architecture on a second screen. Standard admin access wouldn't even know to look there. She buried it in a directory labeled Routine Imaging Archive from 2019. He was already typing. With the path and the key, I can have a read-confirmed copy routed through our compliance server in how long? 18 minutes if nothing's flagged. You have 15. After 15, I need you to have everything or nothing. Reyes was already on his phone, talking fast and quiet to someone Damien couldn't identify. Marcus stood at Damien's shoulder. And if it triggers the flag, then we have a problem with a 20-minute countdown that starts from the moment it trips. Damien checked his watch, which is why we're starting now. He went back into the ballroom. Julian was at his table, smiling at something the senator's wife had said. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man who had just been publicly honored in front of everyone in the city who mattered. and who was sitting at the center of the life he had built, and who had every reason to believe that everything was exactly as he'd arranged it. Celine was across the room, 3 tables over, talking to the Harrington Foundation's communications director with the precise engagement of a professional who was very good at her job. She didn't look toward Damien, he didn't look toward her. He sat down at his table, picked up his water glass, and watched the room with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had learned to wait. And he thought about what she'd said. He'll flag the case as administratively closed. There's no appeals process that works fast enough. And he thought about a 16-year-old boy in a hospital bed somewhere in this city. And he thought about the bruise the color of old tobacco along the lower left side of a woman's back. And he held completely still. At 10:03 p.m., his phone vibrated once in his jacket pocket. He excused himself from the table, walked to the corridor, and looked at the message from Reyes. File confirmed. Routed. 14 minutes, 40 seconds. He stood in the corridor for a long moment with the phone in his hand and the noise of the party muffled behind the door. Then the door opened and Julian Mercer stepped into the corridor, and the easy smile was completely gone, and he was looking at Damien with an expression that was nothing like the one the cameras got. And he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, "I think it's time you and I had a conversation about what your assistant has been doing with hospital records." Damien put his phone in his pocket. He looked at Julian Mercer, at the practiced confidence, at the specific quality of anger underneath the surface, at the hands that weren't quite still at his sides. And he understood with total clarity that the thing he'd been managing quietly in the background of this evening had just moved into a different register entirely. "I think you might be right," Damien said, and his voice was completely even, and he didn't move. Julian's jaw tightened. Behind the closed door, 260 guests continued their evening, and the string quartet played something expensive, and somewhere across the city a 16-year-old boy with a damaged heart was sleeping in a hospital bed with no idea that the world was about to shift in every direction at once. The corridor had that specific kind of quiet that only existed in spaces adjacent to noise. The muffled bass of the string quartet leaking through the ballroom door, the distant clink of crystal, and the low wash of 260 people performing their best versions of themselves. And inside that quiet, Damien Voss and Julian Mercer stood 8 feet apart and looked at each other with the particular attention of men who had each spent years learning to read a room and were now deploying that skill against each other for the first time. Julian had left his award on the table inside. He'd come out here without it, which meant he'd come out here deliberately, which meant the conversation he wanted to have was not one he wanted witnessed. Damien filed that. "I'm going to be direct with you," Julian said. His voice was measured, the same register he used on camera, but something underneath it was running too fast. "I don't know exactly what Celine has told you or what she's asked you to help her find, but I want you to understand the full picture before this goes any further." "Go ahead." Julian's eyes moved over Damien's face with the diagnostic speed of a man accustomed to assessing situations quickly. "She's not well. I want to be clear that I'm saying this with complete compassion and no judgment, because I love her and I have genuinely tried, to get her the support she needs. But she has been constructing a narrative that has no basis in reality, and she has been doing it for months, and I think on some level she believes it, which is what makes it so difficult." Damien said nothing. "She has made accusations before," Julian continued. "Not to me directly, but to people at the hospital. Staff members who came to me very uncomfortable because they cared about both of us and didn't know what to do with what she'd said." He paused with the timing of a man who had rehearsed this. "I had to make a very painful decision about how to handle it professionally. I involved HR. I involved 2 board members I trust. It was the most difficult thing I've done in my career, and I did it because the alternative was allowing her to damage herself further by escalating something that wasn't real." "You had her complaints buried," Damien said. Julian's expression shifted just slightly. "I had a professional review process initiated. Yes. The outcome was that 3 people who reported what they saw got routed through an HR process you had influence over, and their complaints got closed without action." The measured quality in Julian's voice developed a hairline fracture. "Who told you you came out here to have a conversation?" Damien said. "Have it." Julian looked at him for a moment. Then something in his posture changed. A small, careful adjustment. The kind of recalibration that happened when a man decided one approach wasn't working and shifted to another without telegraphing the transition. "I know about the server access," Julian said. "I know someone ran a retrieval on a specific directory at 9:52 tonight. I know the IP routes back to this building." He let that sit for a moment. "What I don't know yet is how much of what's in that file your people have actually been able to interpret correctly, because without context, the file is self-explanatory. Medical records are never self-explanatory. Transplant priority decisions involve dozens of variables, clinical factors, logistical realities that a layperson reviewing a spreadsheet would not. The donor payment records are also self-explanatory." The hairline fracture widened. Julian was quiet for 4 full seconds, the kind of quiet that meant rapid internal calculation rather than composure. When he spoke again, the warmth had been stripped out of his voice entirely. Not replaced with anger, which would have been readable, but with something colder and more precise. "What do you want?" he said. "I want to go back inside and finish my evening," Damien said. "What I want after that is for Ethan Carter's transplant priority to be handled by an independent clinical review team with no connection to your foundation or your board relationships. I want every complaint that was filed and closed in the last 18 months reopened under an external auditor. And I want your administrative access to the placement coordination system revoked by Monday." Julian stared at him. "In exchange for what?" he said. "Nothing. Those aren't terms, those are outcomes." "That's not how this works." "I know how you think this works," Damien said. "You think this is a negotiation. You think you have leverage because you have influence with the right people and a public image that makes accusations look like attacks on charity. That worked when the only person who knew what you were doing was someone you could threaten." He paused. "It doesn't work when the documentation is already off your server." Julian's face went through something complicated. "You have no idea what you're involving yourself in." "I have a reasonable idea. This isn't about the foundation. The people who are—" He stopped himself. Something moved through his expression that was harder to classify than anger, something that looked, briefly, like warning. "There are people with interests in the Foundation's operations who are significantly more difficult to manage than I am. If you push on this publicly tonight, you are not just disrupting my career, you are creating a problem with individuals who do not respond the way I respond." Damien looked at him steadily. "Is that a threat?" "It's a description of the situation." "Then I'll add it to my understanding of the situation." Damien adjusted his jacket. "Go back inside. Finish your evening. Smile for the photographs." He held Julian's gaze for one flat, final second. "Because this is the last evening that looks like this for you." He opened the ballroom door and walked back in. Coulter. Celine was where he'd left her, talking to the communications director, but her eyes found him the moment he crossed the threshold with the accuracy of someone who had been tracking the door from across the room. He gave her nothing, no signal, no look that meant anything, and went back to his table and sat down and picked up his water glass with a completely steady hand and thought about what Julian had said. People with interests in the Foundation's operations who are significantly more difficult to manage than I am. That was a real thing. That was not a bluff deployed by a cornered man. That was a man pointing at something behind him in the dark and being genuinely certain it was there. Damien had spent enough years adjacent to the specific ecosystem of institutionalized corruption to recognize the difference between manufactured threat and observed reality, and what Julian had just described had the texture of observed reality. It meant the Foundation wasn't Julian's construct alone. It meant he was a visible face over an infrastructure with other stakeholders, other people with reasons to keep the system functioning, people for whom a pediatric surgeon with a charitable public image was useful in the way a door is useful, not as the destination, but as access. Marcus appeared at the table and crouched slightly, level with Damien's ear. "He made 2 calls in the corridor before he went back to his table," Marcus said. "Reyes is pulling the metadata now. The numbers are coming." "Good." "There's something else." Marcus kept his voice below the ambient noise. "The flag trip on the server didn't go to Julian's personal system first." Damien kept his expression neutral. "Where did it go?" "Secondary address? External. Reyes says the routing is commercial. Looks like a private infrastructure firm. He's tracking the registration now, but it's layered. How layered? Layered enough that whoever set it up didn't want it found quickly. Damien set down his water glass. He looked at the room, at the chandeliers, at the cameras, at 260 people in expensive clothes performing the ritual of collective generosity, at the mayor's table and the senator's table and the Harrington Foundation board members at their table, and at Julian Mercer sitting with his award and his beautiful smile, laughing at something the woman beside him had said. "Tell Reyes to stop working on the hospital file," Damien said. Marcus paused. "Sir, we have it. Confirmed copy, routed and secured. Tell him to pivot everything to the secondary address. I want to know who owns that infrastructure before midnight." "Copy." Marcus stood and moved away. Damien picked up his water glass again and looked at it for a moment and thought about the architecture of what he was looking at. The foundation, the transplant system, the buried complaints, the secondary server address that routed the alert away from Julian first, and felt the shape of something larger than a surgeon with a violent temper and convenient board connections begin to assemble itself in his mind. He looked across the room at Celine. She was listening to the communications director with the alert, focused expression she brought to every professional interaction, and she looked, from this distance, like exactly what she had always appeared to be, the most competent person in any room she entered. 7 months, she'd said. She'd been building that file for 7 months. He thought about what it cost to do that. To live inside a situation that was destroying you, to perform the normalcy of it for every person around you, to absorb every blow and continue building the case anyway, one document at a time, while managing a full-time job and a 16-year-old brother's medical situation, and the specific grinding terror of knowing that one wrong step would eliminate both your exit and your siblings' survival. 7 months of that. He felt something in his chest that wasn't the cold calculation he'd been operating on all evening. He named it and moved past it. At 10:31 p.m., Julian stood from his table and made his way toward the east side of the room with the confident, unhurried movement of a man who owned his own presence in every space he occupied. He stopped twice, once to shake a hand, once to accept a brief embrace from a woman Damien recognized as a hospital board member, and then continued to the east corridor, the one that led toward the auxiliary presentation area and the private guest bathrooms. Celine watched him go. Damien watched her watch him go. Then he watched her excuse herself from the communications director, set down her glass, and follow Julian toward the east corridor. He was out of his chair in 4 seconds. Tunkits. The east corridor was longer than the north, better lit, with a carpeted runner that absorbed footsteps. Damien heard voices before he rounded the secondary turn. Julian's and Celine's, in that register just below Ray's that people used when they were trying very hard not to be overheard while saying things that had too much force to be quiet. He stopped at the turn and listened. "Told you to leave it alone." Julian's voice. "I told you 6 weeks ago what would happen if you kept—" "I don't know what you're talking about." Celine's voice was flat and controlled. "The server. Someone accessed the server tonight, from this building." A pause. "It was him, wasn't it? You gave him access." "I gave no one access to anything." "Celine." The word landed with a specific kind of weight, not a question, not a statement, but a warning with her name wrapped around it. "I have been patient with you. I have been more patient than most men would be, and I need you to understand that patience has a functional limit, and we are at it." "I understand you," she said. "Do you? Because I'm standing here trying to give you an opportunity to correct something before it becomes irreversible, and you're giving me the face you give people in meetings, and that tells me you haven't understood the seriousness of—" "I understand the seriousness." "Then tell me what you gave him." "I told you nothing." The sound that came next wasn't loud. It was the sound of a hand contacting a wall or a surface. Not a person, not yet, but close enough to a person to communicate the same information. Controlled violence, the kind designed to make the space feel smaller. Damien moved around the corner. Julian had one hand flat against the wall to the left of Celine's head, not touching her. Positioned close enough that the geometry of it said everything his hand was communicating. Celine stood completely still with her back to the wall and her chin level and her eyes on Julian's face with an expression that was not fear and not defiance, but something that existed in the specific register between them. The practiced, calibrated stillness of someone who had learned to manage a situation like this by becoming as small and as steady as possible. "Step back," Damien said. Julian turned. The controlled composure he'd brought to their conversation in the north corridor was thinner now. It was still there, but it had the quality of something being maintained by effort rather than instinct. "This doesn't involve you," Julian said. "Step back from her." "I'm having a private conversation with my fiancée." "You're not." Damien came down the corridor until he was close enough that Julian would have to move to maintain the geometry. "You're done having this conversation. Step back." For a moment, the corridor held the three of them in a specific arrangement of force and will, and Damien was aware of his own breathing, the even and deliberate rhythm he used when situations required absolute stillness, and he was aware of Julian calculating. The cameras, the guests 40 feet away through a closed door, the specific cost-benefit of escalation in a corridor during a charity gala broadcast by 3 television outlets. Julian stepped back. He did it with the controlled precision of a man who was choosing to step back, not being made to. And the distinction was in every micro-movement of his face and his posture, and Damien let him have it because the outcome was the same and the distinction didn't matter. "Celine," Damien said, keeping his eyes on Julian. "I'm fine," she said. "I know. Come out of the corridor." She moved past Julian with 3 inches of clearance, and Damien felt her pass behind him toward the main room, and he stood where he was for another 4 seconds looking at Julian Mercer. And what he was looking at was a man whose architecture was under pressure from multiple directions at once, and who was beginning to respond to that pressure in ways he could no longer fully manage. "You've made a mistake tonight," Julian said quietly. "I've made several," Damien said. "The one I haven't made is leaving this alone." He turned and walked back toward the main room. Chakit. Celine was at the bar with sparkling water she wasn't drinking, her back to the room, when he reached her. He didn't stand beside her. He stood 1 step behind and to her left, in the position that gave him a sightline to the corridor exit and to the room simultaneously. "Are you all right?" he said. "I said I was fine." "I know what you said." A beat. She set the sparkling water down. "He's going to move, tonight. He won't wait to see what you have." "I know. He has someone he calls when things go wrong. I've heard it twice. He goes to a room alone and he calls a number he doesn't keep on his regular phone." She kept her voice completely flat. "The calls are always short. Whatever happens after them happens fast." Damien processed this in the context of what Marcus had told him: the secondary server address, the external infrastructure, the layered registration. "Do you know who the number belongs to?" "No, I tried to find out. I couldn't get close enough." He looked at the room. Julian had emerged from the east corridor and was back among the guests, and someone had refilled his drink. And he was smiling again at something being said to him, and the smile was so perfectly reconstructed that Damien felt a cold and specific disgust move through him. "There's something else in the file," Celine said. He waited. "There's a patient, named in 4 separate documents over 14 months. A child, 10 years old, with a congenital defect that placed her 3rd on the priority list at the time Julian took over the Foundation's coordination role." She paused. By the time she received treatment, she'd been on the list for 2 years. She'd dropped from 3rd to 12th, and back to 4th, and down again. Every movement corresponded to a Foundation donor cycle. He didn't say anything. She survived, but the delay caused secondary complications that wouldn't have occurred with earlier intervention. Her voice did not change register. "Her name is Mia. I've never met her, but I have her file and Julian's emails and the donor ledger that explains every single movement on that list." Another pause. "That's the file I built it around. Every other record in the archive is organized to support her case." Damien was quiet for a moment. "When the time comes," he said, "that file goes to the State Medical Board and the Federal Health Oversight Office simultaneously. Not the press first, the regulatory bodies first, so we can't suppress it before the official record is created." "I know," she said. "I know the sequence. I've had the sequence planned for 4 months. What I didn't have, she stopped, was someone who could hold him in place long enough to use it, Damien said. She was quiet. That's what tonight was supposed to be, he said. You were going to use the gala, the cameras, the witnesses, the public setting. Do something here that made it impossible for him to move against Ethan before the records were already in the right hands. She picked up the sparkling water, set it down again. I didn't have enough yet. I thought I did. And then 3 weeks ago he got careful, and I realized he suspected something, and the sequence I'd planned required a specific document I couldn't access without triggering the flag. The document Reyes just retrieved. Yes. Damien looked at the room again. At Julian. At the cameras. At the 260 people who had spent $5,000 each to be in the same room as the city's golden hero and were going home tonight with that story intact. The one where Julian Mercer was a man who healed children and loved his fiancée and wept with gratitude when he received his award. How long do you need, he said, to route the files to the right agencies and ensure they're received and logged before he can block them? She considered. 3 hours if the routing is clean. The regulatory agencies have an emergency intake process for patient safety disclosures that creates an automatic logged record the moment it's received. Once it's in the system, he can't make it disappear. 3 hours, he said. Yes. It's 10:38 now. If Reyes starts the routing at 11, you have confirmation by 2 a.m. That's the math. Damien took out his phone and sent a 2-word message to Marcus. Start routing. He put the phone back. There's one more thing, Celine said. Her voice had changed. Not much, but enough. A fraction lower. The fraction that meant she was about to say something she'd been deciding whether to say for longer than the last 30 seconds. I need you to understand that I'm not doing this because of you. I'm not doing it because you came into that room tonight and I decided to trust you. I know. I'm doing it because Mia's file is complete and Ethan's window is closing, and I have been waiting for the right sequence for 7 months and it's finally here. She looked at him directly for the first time in several minutes. What you did tonight, what you're doing, it changes the variables. It makes the sequence viable, but I need you to know that I would have found another way. I don't doubt that, he said. She held his gaze for a moment and then she looked back at the room and the armor was back in place, and she picked up her sparkling water and actually drank some of it. He's going to make his call soon, she said. Whoever he calls, whoever picks up, things will start moving. We won't have 3 hours of clean runway. We don't need 3 hours of clean runway. We need the files in the system before he can act on whatever gets set in motion. Damien watched Julian across the room. Once the intake confirmation is generated, the process is federal. He can't touch it. And Ethan. Marcus has someone at the hospital already. Routine courtesy call to the floor charge nurse. If anything changes in the administrative system before 2 a.m., we'll know within 10 minutes. Celine absorbed this. He watched her do it, watched the information settle, watched her run her own assessment of it, watched her decide whether it was adequate. All right, she said. Across the room, Julian had drifted toward the edge of the gathering, near the private entrance that led to the building's secondary stairwell. He said something brief to the man beside him, and then stepped through the door with the natural, unhurried movement of someone stepping out to take a call. Damien clocked it at 10:44 p.m. He's making the call, he said. Celine didn't turn around. I know. Yeet. Marcus tracked Julian to the 18th floor. He didn't follow him up. That would have been visible, and Marcus was operating with a level of visibility that hovered just above 0. But the stairwell cameras in the Blackwood International Building were Marcus's cameras, and at 10:51 p.m., Damien was looking at a still frame on Marcus's tablet of Julian Mercer standing in the 18th floor lobby with a phone pressed to his ear that was not the phone he'd brought to the gala. A second phone. A clean one, probably. Duration, Damien said. 4 minutes, 12 seconds. He was back in the stairwell by 10:53. 4 minutes was a long call for whatever Julian was running on that number. Long enough for information and instruction. Long enough for something to be set in motion. The routing, Damien said. Marcus checked his secondary screen. Reyes says 11 minutes to confirmation on the first intake. Federal health oversight first, then the state board. He's running them parallel. Is he clean? So far, no flag activity since the initial trip. Damien handed back the tablet. He went back to the ballroom. Julian was back at his table, and Damien spent 30 seconds watching him across the room before he understood what was different. The performance was intact, the smile, the posture, the fluent social engagement, but something underneath it had changed in quality. It had become less like a man at ease and more like a man who had finished waiting. The subtle difference between anticipation and readiness. He'd made the call and received an answer and was now in a different phase. At 11:07 p.m., Damien's phone vibrated. Marcus. Intake confirmed. Federal. 11:06 timestamp. State board routing in 4 minutes. He stood at the edge of the room and looked at Julian Mercer and thought, it's done. Or close enough to done that the difference no longer matters. The files are in the system. The timestamp exists. Whatever he does next, he cannot make that disappear. Then his phone vibrated again. A different number. Reyes directly. Problem. Secondary address just went active. External system queried the hospital network at 11:04. Not Julian. Different credentials. Damien looked at the message for 3 seconds. The secondary address. The one routed to an external infrastructure firm. Someone else had access to it, and someone else had just queried the hospital network at 11:04. 3 minutes after Julian's 4-minute call, which meant Julian's call had not been to a person who would wait for morning. He texted Marcus. Hospital. Now. What's happening on Ethan Carter's file? 40 seconds. The longest 40 seconds of the evening. Then, administrative flag triggered at 11:02. Transfer order being processed. Not a clinical transfer. Admin. Damien was already moving toward the exit. He texted Celine a single word. Come. And then, because he was still Damien Voss and he had not built 11 years of operational infrastructure to abandon it in a crisis, he stopped 3 feet from the ballroom exit and texted Marcus a second message. Stop the transfer. Whatever it takes. Do not let that order go through. He sent it and pushed through the door into the corridor, and she was already there. She had been tracking the room, and she'd seen his face change, and she'd moved before he'd sent the message. And now she was standing in the corridor with her phone in her hand and her face completely still, and her eyes asking the question her mouth hadn't formed yet. He looked at her. Ethan, he said. She went pale. Not dramatically, not the pale of someone losing composure, but the specific cellular pallor of someone absorbing information that hits at the structural level, below the place where performance lived. The green gown, the careful hair, the armor, all of it still in place, and underneath it, a woman whose brother was 16 years old with a damaged heart and whose worst-case scenario had just become the current situation. He moved the transfer order, Damien said, at 11:02. Someone else queried the system at 11:04. Marcus is at the hospital. Which hospital? Her voice was completely steady. St. Callaway Children's. Marcus is already... He won't transfer him from St. Callaway. She was already processing, her eyes moving in the rapid internal way of someone running probabilities. Julian has a relationship with the administrative director at Mercy West. He'll try to route him there. The transfer would look routine. Voluntary family request if he forged the authorization. Can he forge your authorization? She looked at him. Can he? He said again. He has my signature on 3 years of his foundation documentation, she said. He knows my notarization contact. If he had 24 hours, he didn't have 24 hours. He had 40 minutes. 40 minutes is enough for a provisional order. The full authorization isn't required for a provisional administrative hold. It only requires... She stopped. A physician referral from the admitting doctor, and Julian is the attending physician of record on Ethan's case. Damien stared at her. She stared back. The physician of record, which meant Julian had had the ability to initiate a provisional transfer order from inside the hospital system using only his own credentials, and which meant the forged signature was an additional layer that didn't even need to exist for the order to move. He's been the attending physician since Ethan was admitted, Celine said. Her voice was still steady, but something underneath it was vibrating at a frequency that had nothing to do with composure. I thought... I knew he had leverage through the foundation, through the board relationships. I thought the documentation I was building was the mechanism he'd use. I didn't think. She stopped again. You didn't think he'd use the clinical relationship directly? He's a pediatric surgeon. Using the clinical relationship directly would expose him to licensing liability. It would be the most visible possible move. I didn't think he'd risk. He's been cornered, Damien said. Cornered men don't optimize for visibility. Her phone rang. She looked at it, looked at Damien. It was a number he could see from 3 feet away, and he didn't recognize it. And from her face, she didn't either, but she answered it because the situation was past the point where unknown numbers could go to voicemail. She listened for 7 seconds. Then she said, "Where is he now?" Listened again. "Don't let them move him. Tell them there's a medical dispute about the transfer order and you need the charge nurse present before any authorization is processed." Pause. "I don't care. Tell them anything. Stall." She hung up. "That was someone at the hospital," she said. "A nurse named Pilar. She was one of the people who filed a complaint 18 months ago. She knows about Ethan. She's been watching his case unofficially." Her jaw tightened. Julian's administrative order reached the floor 10 minutes ago. They're waiting on a second authorization to execute. Pilar says there's a man she doesn't recognize in the hallway outside Ethan's room. Marcus should be there by now. The man was there before Marcus arrived. Damien looked at his phone. No update from Marcus. "Stay here," he said. "That's my brother. I know who he is. Stay here for 3 minutes while I—" "Damien." She said his name for the first time. Not Mr. Voss, not a professional form of address, but his name, stripped clean and direct. And he stopped. "I am not staying anywhere. I am going to that hospital. You can come with me or you can stay here and manage your gala, but I'm going." He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. "My car's in the private garage," he said. 45th level. We have 4 minutes before the valet rotation." She was already moving. He followed her to the elevator and the doors closed and the floor numbers dropped and he texted Marcus from the descending car. "ETA 12 minutes. Hold the room." The elevator hit the garage level with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Celine walked out without waiting for the doors to fully open. And somewhere across Chicago, in a children's hospital room on the 4th floor, a 16-year-old boy with a damaged heart was sleeping through a night that was about to become something none of them could fully predict, surrounded by people with competing intentions and a transfer order working its way through an administrative system that had been weaponized by the man who was supposed to be saving. The car hit 47 miles per hour inside the parking garage before Damien eased it back, the tires reading the descent ramp with a low, continuous sound like something under pressure. And Celine sat in the passenger seat with both hands flat on her knees and her phone screen lighting her face every 30 seconds as she checked for updates from the nurse named Pilar. Nothing. Then nothing again. "She's not responding," Celine said. "She's stalling a transfer order in a hallway. She's not going to be on her phone. She said she'd text when she could. Not when we needed her to." Damien took the final ramp at speed and came out onto the street level with the city opening up in every direction, the late-night grid of lights and moving cars, and the indifferent infrastructure of Chicago going about its business at 11:14 on a Thursday. "Navigation says 9 minutes. Take Michigan to Roosevelt. The construction on Wabash adds 4. He took Michigan. The city moved past the windows in the specific way it moved when you were inside something urgent. Not faster, but with a quality of heightened registration, every stoplight and pedestrian and turning vehicle gaining a weight it didn't have under normal circumstances. Celine watched the road ahead without moving. Her hands on her knees hadn't shifted position since the garage. He glanced at her once. "Tell me about the man in the hallway," he said. Pilar said she didn't recognize him. Not hospital staff, not a family member. He was standing outside Ethan's room in street clothes, and he told her he was waiting for someone from administration. She paused. No one from administration sent him. She checked. Which means Julian made 2 calls before he left the stairwell. One to whoever owns the secondary infrastructure. One to whoever that man is. Or the same call accomplished both. Damien considered this. What does he need from the room? Celine was quiet for a moment. Ethan's admission bracelet has a patient ID that's required for the transfer authorization. It's a physical scan. They need the bracelet number to complete the administrative hold. Another pause. You can pull it from the system, but it's faster to scan the physical bracelet directly. The man in the hallway is there to get the number, Damien said, or to make sure Ethan's still in the room when the transfer team arrives. He didn't say anything to that. She didn't either. Ooh. Marcus was in the fourth floor corridor when they came out of the elevator, and he had positioned himself between the elevator bank and the hallway junction with the particular quality of stillness that meant he'd been there long enough to have assessed everything and was waiting to deliver the assessment. "The man is gone," Marcus said, before Damien had covered the distance. "Left approximately 6 minutes ago. Pilar said he walked out when I came through the main entrance. Probably had a visual on the lobby. Did she get anything on him? Approximate 40s, dark jacket, no hospital ID. She didn't see his face clearly." Marcus fell in beside them as they moved toward the hallway. "The transfer order is still in the system. The second authorization hasn't processed yet. The charge nurse flagged it for a supervisor review after Pilar raised the dispute. That bought about 20 minutes. 20 minutes from when? Celine said. From about 10:58. So, Marcus checked his watch. 11 and change remaining. Can you get the order pulled? Damien said. Not from outside the hospital's administrative system. It needs to come from a physician with standing or from an authorized family member with verified ID. Celine was already moving past Marcus toward Ethan's room. Damien stayed with Marcus for 3 seconds. The secondary address. What did Reyes find? Infrastructure registered to a shell company out of Delaware. 3 layers of ownership that terminate in a numbered trust in the Cayman system. Marcus's voice was flat and precise. But Reyes found a shared certificate with another entity that used the same registration firm in 2019. That entity has a Chicago address and a board of directors that includes 2 names you're going to want to sit down for. Give them to me standing. Harlan Goss, Chief Administrative Officer at Mercy West Hospital since 2017. Damien processed this in 1 second. Mercy West. The hospital Celine had said Julian would route Ethan to. And the second name, he said. Vincent Alcott. Marcus held his gaze. The senator's chief of staff. The senator who had been at the gala tonight, who had shaken Julian's hand and stood in the photographs and represented, in this specific configuration of information, not a political ally but a structural component of whatever this actually was. The foundation isn't Julian's construction, Damien said. No. He's the face of something with significantly larger infrastructure behind it. That's what the certificate suggests. We don't have the full picture yet. Damien looked down the hallway toward Ethan's room. Through the window in the door, he could see Celine at the bedside. The boy asleep, monitors, the specific stillness of a hospital room at night. And he watched her put her hand over her brother's without waking him, and he thought about the infrastructure and the senator's chief of staff and Harlan Goss at Mercy West and the man in the dark jacket who had been standing in this hallway an hour ago. Keep Reyes on the ownership chain, he said. I want every name, tonight. He walked to Ethan's room. Celine was standing beside the bed when he came in, and she didn't turn around when she heard the door. Ethan Carter was asleep with the particular depth of someone on monitored rest. Not peaceful exactly, but the managed unconsciousness of a body that had been through enough that sleep required pharmaceutical assistance. He was slight for 16, thinner than he should have been, with the careful stillness that came from a cardiac condition that punished exertion. His admission bracelet was on his left wrist. Damien stood at the door and let her have the moment. After 30 seconds, she said without turning, His cardiologist is Dr. Yuen. She's the one who placed him on the list. She's not connected to Julian's network. I checked her independently 8 months ago. If I can get a message to her tonight and get her to file a clinical dispute against the transfer order, does she have standing to override Julian's attending authority? As a specialist of record, she has equal clinical standing. A dispute between 2 physicians of record triggers an automatic administrative review that suspends the transfer order for 72 hours. She turned then, and her face was doing the same thing it had done in the corridor at the gala. The armor in place, the careful arrangement of control, and underneath it the frequency vibrating at a register she couldn't fully suppress. "I need her number. I had it on my work phone, and my work phone is in your desk at the office. I left it there this morning. I was bringing the personal phone tonight because—" She stopped herself. Because Julian monitored her work phone. Damien understood this without her finishing the sentence. "I'll get Reyes to find a contact number for Dr. Ewan," he said, taking out his phone. "The hospital operator will have a physician on-call line. Reyes will be faster." He sent the request. 40 seconds later, he had a direct mobile number for Dr. Linda Ewan, pediatric cardiology, and he handed the phone to Celine and stepped back toward the door to give her room. She dialed, waited. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. She dialed again. 4 rings. Then a voice, sleep-roughened, careful. "This is Dr. Ewan. Dr. Ewan, this is Celine Carter, Ethan Carter's sister. I'm sorry to call at this hour." Her voice was absolutely level. "There's a transfer order being processed on Ethan's case tonight, and I'm contesting it. I need you to file a clinical dispute against it before the second authorization processes. I have approximately—" She looked at Marcus in the doorway, who held up 10 fingers. 10 minutes. A pause on the line, then Dr. Ewan, more awake now. "Who initiated the transfer order?" "Dr. Julian Mercer. He's the attending physician of record." Another pause. Longer. "Ms. Carter." Dr. Ewan's voice had changed in quality. "Julian Mercer is not Ethan's attending physician as of this evening." Celine went still. Damien, 3 feet away, watched it happen. "I'm sorry," Celine said. "Can you—" The attending assignment was updated in the system at 10:47 tonight. Ethan was moved to Dr. Mercer's direct service at 10:47. Before that, he was listed under the general cardiology service. He was under general cardiology service. Since admission, yes. He was on my service as specialist of record, but the attending of record was the floor's general rotation. Dr. Ewan paused. "Someone changed it tonight at 10:47, to Dr. Mercer specifically." 10:47. 13 minutes after Julian had come back from the stairwell where he'd made his 4-minute call. Damien did the math in real time. Julian had made the call at 10:44. He'd been back in the ballroom by 10:53. And at 10:47, while he was still in the stairwell or moving back, someone had changed Ethan's attending physician of record in the hospital's administrative system. Someone with system access. Someone on the inside. Not Julian. Julian had been on the phone. Someone else. "Dr. Ewan," Celine said. Her voice had dropped to a register that was almost inaudible. "If you file a clinical dispute as specialist of record, does it suspend the transfer order?" "It initiates a review, but if the attending is already Dr. Mercer, my dispute authority as specialist is secondary to his attending authority. The review board would defer to the attending on an emergency transfer." A pause. "Unless there are grounds to remove him from the case entirely, that requires a formal complaint to the department head, and how long does that take?" "In normal circumstances, 48 to 72 hours. And in emergency circumstances." Dr. Ewan was quiet for a moment. "With documented evidence of clinical misconduct, the department head can issue a temporary removal with a same-day review. But the evidence threshold is—" "I have it," Celine said. "I have 14 months of documentation, patient records, foundation correspondence, donor payment cross-references. Where do I send it?" Silence on the line. Then, "Give me 10 minutes to pull up the system. And Ms. Carter, whoever is with you right now, keep them in that room. Don't let anyone authorize any movement on Ethan until I've made a call to the department head." "Thank you." She hung up. She handed Damien his phone back. Her hand was completely steady. "Someone changed the attending assignment from inside the system at 10:47, Damien said. "I heard. That's not Julian. Julian was on the phone." "I know." She looked at the phone. "Someone on the inside did it. Someone with administrative system access." "Harlan Goss is the CAO at Mercy West," Damien said. "Marcus found a shell company connection between Goss's network and the secondary server address that received the flag alert tonight. But Mercy West and St. Callaway are separate institutions." They share an administrative network, Celine said. Her voice was quiet and very specific. The Chicago Regional Health Consortium. 7 hospitals on a shared electronic records infrastructure. Mercy West joined in 2021. St. Callaway has been on it since 2018. Damien looked at her. I know about the consortium because Julian mentioned it twice. He said the shared network made certain administrative coordination easier. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. She paused. I understand now. The shared network meant Goss, or anyone with the right credentials in the consortium system, had administrative access to St. Callaway's records, including attending physician assignments. The foundation wasn't just about transplant list manipulation. It was about control of the entire administrative infrastructure across 7 hospitals. Damien leaned against the wall beside the door and looked at the ceiling for exactly 2 seconds. The amount of time he allowed himself when a situation turned out to be larger than the frame he'd built for it. And then he looked back at Celine. Send the file, he said. All of it, to Dr. Ewan's system, to the federal intake you already confirmed, to the state board. And then I need you to tell me everything you know about the consortium. I'll tell you what I know, which is less than we need. She was already on the phone again, pulling up the encrypted routing interface she'd apparently had prepared in advance. A woman who had spent 7 months building a system she was ready to deploy the moment the sequence was right. What I know is 14 months of one visible piece of it. The piece with Julian's name on it. What's the piece without his name on it? That's what I don't know. They spent 18 minutes in that room. Marcus stood in the hallway and managed the floor. Reyes worked the ownership chain from wherever Reyes worked, which Damien had never asked about specifically and didn't ask about now. Dr. Ewan called the department head at 11:31, and by 11:44 had obtained a verbal preliminary suspension of Julian's attending authority pending documentation review. Not a full removal, not yet, but enough to freeze the transfer order in the system with a clinical flag that required a department-level signature to override. The 20-minute window had closed. The transfer order was suspended. Ethan slept through all of it. At 11:51, Damien stood in the hallway with Marcus and thought about the shape of what they were inside. He had known coming into tonight that Julian Mercer was a man who hurt women and manipulated medical systems for money. That was a finite problem with documented edges. It was ugly and it was serious, and it required the right sequence of regulatory and legal actions to dismantle. But it was finite. What it had turned out to be was an access point, a visible, manageable face over a much larger infrastructure, a shared hospital network, a Delaware shell company, a senator's chief of staff, and a CAO at another institution who could reach across institutional lines with credentials that left no obvious fingerprints. And the question that was assembling itself in Damien's mind with increasing urgency was, how far does it go? And who knows we're here? His phone buzzed. Reyes. Third ownership layer resolves to a trust with 2 beneficial owners. First name is Goss. Second name is Whitmore. C. Running it now. Damien stared at the name. Whitmore. He knew the name. Not from Julian, not from the foundation, not from anything connected to the healthcare system. He knew it from a different context entirely. A context that was 11 years old, and that he had spent 11 years being careful around with the specific care of someone who understood exactly what careful meant in that territory. Congressman Carl Whitmore. Retired 2021. Before that, 11 years on the House Committee on Health and Human Services, during which time he had been, among other things, a reliable supporter of regulatory reform initiatives that had happened to make consortium-style hospital administrative networks significantly easier to structure and significantly harder to audit. Damien put his phone in his pocket. He stood in the hospital corridor at 11:53 at night and understood that the problem he had walked into tonight was not Julian Mercer. Julian Mercer was a man who had been handed a mechanism by people with far more sophisticated interests and who had used it in the way that small, mean people used powerful tools, for personal control, for money, for the specific pleasure of having leverage over someone who couldn't fight back. The mechanism itself was much older and much larger and had a congressman's retired fingerprints on it. He went back into Ethan's room. Celine was sitting in the chair beside the bed now, her phone dark in her hand, the green gown completely out of place in the hospital light, and she looked up when he came in with the particular expression of someone who had just finished a very long internal negotiation. "The routing is confirmed," she said. "All files. Federal intake, state board, and I sent a full copy to a journalist at the Tribune I've had contact with for 2 months. She's been building a piece on pediatric transplant system equity, and I gave her the file as background 4 weeks ago under embargo." She paused. "I lifted the embargo at 11:48. Damien looked at her. "It goes live when she decides it goes live," Celine said, "which is now her decision. I can't pull it back." He thought about that for a moment. The journalist was a variable he hadn't known existed. A public narrative, once started, was a different kind of infrastructure from a regulatory filing. Faster, louder, less controlled, harder to suppress, and also harder to direct. "Who is she?" he said. "Dana Marsh, Tribune Investigative Desk. She's been on healthcare corruption for 3 years. She's good." Celine held his gaze. "I know it's a variable. I've been sitting on it for 4 weeks trying to decide when to use it, and I decided tonight, and I understand if that changes your—" "It doesn't change anything," he said. "It's the right call." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted in a way he couldn't immediately classify. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I found in the file 3 weeks ago that I haven't told anyone." He waited. She looked at Ethan, still sleeping, and then back at Damien. "The consortium network. The shared administrative infrastructure. I told you I found the connection between Julian and the foundation and the transplant manipulation. But when I was tracing the donor payment flows backward, trying to find the origin point, the first documented transaction that established the pattern, I found an account." "Whose account?" "I don't know whose account. It's numbered. It routes through the same Cayman trust structure that Reyes just found." She paused. "But the first transaction in that account, the first time money moved through that mechanism in connection with a transplant priority adjustment, was dated 4 years ago." 4 years ago. Julian had founded the Mercer Children's Foundation 6 years ago. The foundation had taken over coordination with St. Callaway's transplant service 3.5 years ago. The first transaction was 4 years ago, before the formal foundation involvement. "He was doing it before the foundation existed," Damien said. "Or someone was doing it before the foundation existed, and the foundation was created to formalize and scale what was already working." She held his gaze. "The account didn't originate with Julian. The account originated with whatever structure existed before he was brought in." "He was brought in." The phrasing was specific and deliberate. "You think he was recruited," Damien said. "I think someone saw a talented surgeon with certain appetites. For money, for control, for the specific kind of influence that comes from managing who lives and who waits, and built him a vehicle." Her voice was completely flat. "And I think the vehicle served their purposes, and his purposes, for 4 years. And whatever is wrong with Julian Mercer, he is not the top of this." Damien thought about Congressman Whitmore's retired fingerprints and Harlan Goss's consortium credentials and a senator's chief of staff on a shared certificate. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Reyes just found the third ownership layer. Whitmore. Carl Whitmore." She was quiet for a moment. "The congressman. Former. He's been out of office for 4 years. He's been out of public office for 4 years." Damien moved to the window, the hospital parking lot below. A few cars, an ambulance bay, the normal geometry of an institution at midnight. "He's been operating through private infrastructure since 2021, and the consortium expansion, the one that added Mercy West and 3 other hospitals to the shared network, happened in 2022. After he left office, using relationships he built while he was in office." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Damien turned from the window to look at her and found her sitting very still with her hands on her knees again, the position from the car, and her eyes on the middle distance. "I built a file on Julian," she said. 14 months. Everything I could reach, and it was enough to take him down. It is enough. The federal intake is confirmed. The state board review will move. It will take him down." She paused. "And it will mean nothing to the people behind him. It will expose the mechanism. It will expose one use of the mechanism, They'll close that access point and open another one. Her voice was not bitter. It was simply precise, the way someone is precise when they've had a long time to think about something and have arrived at a conclusion they didn't want but can't avoid. They've been doing this for 4 years across 7 hospitals, and they have the administrative infrastructure and the political cover and the financial architecture to rebuild whatever gets dismantled at the Julian level. Unless the Whitmore connection holds. Unless that. If Reyes can document the ownership chain completely, if the beneficial interest structure is clear enough to establish Whitmore's direct financial involvement in the Foundation's corruption. That takes months, she said. That takes investigators and subpoenas and the kind of legal architecture that doesn't move in hours. It doesn't need to move in hours. It needs to be documented enough tonight that when the Tribune story runs and the Federal Review starts and Julian's world collapses, there's a thread that leads somewhere he can't protect. He looked at her. You don't have to dismantle the whole thing tonight. You have to make sure there's enough visible infrastructure that it can't be quietly buried when the headline fades. She looked at him for a long moment. There's a document in the file, she said slowly. I almost didn't include it because I wasn't sure of its relevance. A meeting summary, Julian's calendar, 2021, a lunch meeting at a private club in the Gold Coast. The notation just says WH consultation. I thought it was a hospital abbreviation. I didn't identify it as Whitmore until last week. Is the document in the file that Reyes routed? Yes, it's in the federal intake. It's minor, a calendar notation, not direct evidence, but it's a timestamp. It places Julian and Whitmore in documented contact in 2021, 3 months before the consortium expansion. That's the thread, Damien said. That's the one that doesn't close. She was quiet for a moment. And then something happened to her face that he had not seen happen before in 11 months. Not the armor failing, not a crack in the controlled surface, but a different thing entirely. A very small, very specific exhaustion, the kind that lives below performance and below will and below even fear. The kind that only surfaces when a person has been carrying something for long enough that the weight itself has become the thing they're most aware of. She looked at her brother. He's going to be scared when he wakes up, she said. Her voice was different, quieter. The professional precision was still there, but it was thinner, like paper held in front of light. He doesn't know any of this. He knows Julian makes him uncomfortable, and he knows I seem tired lately, and he knows something is wrong because he's 16 and not stupid, but he doesn't know what's been happening. Damien didn't say anything. When I found out about the transplant manipulation, about Mia, specifically, about what Julian had done to her case, I almost went to the state board immediately. That night, I had enough for a preliminary complaint. It wasn't the complete file, but it was enough to trigger an inquiry. She paused. And then I thought about what an inquiry would do to Ethan's case while it was active, while Julian still had administrative standing, while there was still a window of several months during which he could move things around and flag things and make clerical errors that would take years to correct. She looked away from her brother and back at the window. So I waited, and I kept building the file. And every week I waited was another week of... She stopped. He understood what she hadn't said. Another week of Julian. You made the right call, he said. The file is complete. The intake is confirmed. Ethan's transfer is suspended. Tonight. Her voice was flat again. Tonight those things are true. They'll be true tomorrow. The federal intake creates a logged record that doesn't disappear. And Whitmore. Whitmore is the long game. Tonight was about getting Ethan out of Julian's reach and getting the documentation into systems Julian can't touch. That's done. She looked at him for a long moment, then her phone rang. She looked at the screen, looked at Damien. It was Julian. Neither of them moved for 2 full rings. Answer it, Damien said. She answered. She held it to her ear and she said nothing, and Julian spoke for approximately 20 seconds. And in those 20 seconds, Damien watched her face go through a sequence of changes that was unlike anything he'd seen from her before. Not the armor, not the controlled neutrality, but something raw, something that moved through her expression and left something different behind it when it passed. She lowered the phone. She didn't hang up. She held it at her side, the call still open, and she looked at Damien with an expression that he now recognized, that frequency, the one that vibrated below the surface of everything she showed the world, now completely visible, no longer manageable, no longer pressed down. "He's not calling from the gala," she said. "Where is he calling from?" "He says he's at Mercy West," she paused. "He says Ethan's already there." The room went cold. Damien's eyes went to the bed. Ethan in the bed. Monitors running, the quiet mechanical rhythm of the system. The admission bracelet on the left wrist. He crossed to the bed in 3 steps and looked at the bracelet, and then looked at the monitor and looked at the chart hanging from the footboard and read the patient name on the chart. Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Marcus," Damien said. His voice was completely level. "Who is in this bed?" Marcus looked at the chart. "Ethan Carter, patient ID." "Read the admission date." Marcus looked. A pause. "March 14th. Damien looked at the chart again. The current date was April 9th. "Ethan Carter, admitted March 14th, he said. "What's today?" "April 9th. This chart hasn't been updated since March 14th. The room was completely silent except for the monitors. Damien lifted the edge of the blanket and looked at the patient's hand. The admission bracelet was there. The bracelet said Ethan Carter. The patient was the right approximate age, the right build, the same slight frame he'd seen through the window. But the face was wrong, not dramatically wrong. Not a stranger in the bed. The resemblance was close enough to pass a glance, which was the point. But looking directly, with the specific attention he was now bringing, the structure of the jaw was different, and the hair was slightly darker, and the patient in this bed was not Ethan Carter. Someone had moved Ethan from this room and put someone else here. Before Marcus arrived. Before Pilar raised the dispute. Before the transfer order had processed through the system. "When?" he said. He wasn't talking to Marcus. He was talking to the room. "The man in the hallway," Celine said. Her voice was almost inaudible. "The one who was here before Marcus arrived. He wasn't here to scan the bracelet. He was here to complete the move that was already in progress." Ethan had been gone before any of them got to the hospital. The transfer order through the system, the administrative back and forth, the flag, the dispute, Dr. Ewan's call, the suspended authorization, all of it had been a performance, a mechanism running in the system while the actual movement happened in the physical world, through the corridor, through whatever exit, under whatever cover a compliant administrative infrastructure could provide at 11 o'clock at night. Julian had not been cornered. Julian had let them think he was cornered. And while Celine routed files and Damien managed the system and Marcus held the hallway, a 16-year-old boy with a damaged heart had been quietly moved out of a room in a hospital that shared its administrative network with 7 other institutions across the city, and the man Damien had been watching across a ballroom all evening was now calling from Mercy West to make sure Celine understood exactly what the new arrangement was. She was still holding the phone at her side. He could hear Julian's voice from it, tiny and distant, saying something he couldn't make out. He looked at her face. She was looking at the bed, at the wrong patient, sleeping under a borrowed name. And the expression on her face was not fear and not despair, but something that was neither of those things, something colder and more absolute, the expression of a person who has spent 14 months building a system of careful choices and measured risks and acceptable costs, and has just discovered that the structure they built was constructed on a floor. Celine raised the phone back to her ear. Her hand was steady. Her voice, when it came out, was the voice she used in the worst meetings. The ones where someone was trying to take something from her and wanted her to know it and wanted her to feel it. And she had learned a long time ago that the only thing that mattered in those moments was not letting them hear the frequency underneath. "Tell me where he is," she said. Julian's voice came through clearly enough that Damien, standing 2 feet away, could hear the shape of it. Measured, careful, the performance voice stripped down to something more functional. "He's comfortable. He's resting. He had a good evening until someone started making administrative noise that upset the care team. He's a minor with a cardiac condition, and you moved him without family authorization. I moved him as his attending physician of record, which is a clinical prerogative that doesn't require family authorization for a non-emergency transfer between consortium facilities." A pause. "You know this, Celine. You know the system well enough to know this." She said nothing. "What I'd like," Julian continued, is for you to come to Mercy West tonight. We can sit down and we can talk about the situation clearly without a very brief pause that contained something Damien couldn't name, without the involvement of third parties who don't have complete information about what they've gotten themselves into. And if I come, then we resolve this quietly, the way things should have been resolved 6 months ago. Ethan gets the care he needs from a physician who has his best interests at heart. You and I have an honest conversation about the future, and the people who accessed my foundation systems tonight go back to whatever it is they normally do. You're describing terms. I'm describing an opportunity. The measured quality had an edge under it now. The alternative involves Ethan's case entering an extended administrative review period during which no clinical intervention is possible. You understand what that means for his window. Damien watched Celine's face. She was looking at the bed. At the wrong patient in the wrong bed with the wrong name on the bracelet. The specific evidence of how completely she had been outmaneuvered, and her expression was doing the thing it had done when Julian called, moving through something and leaving something different behind. "I'll come," she said. She hung up. Damien said, "No." "Yes." You walk into Mercy West, and he has every institutional advantage, his credentials, Goss's administrative access, a facility where the people who owe him run the floor. You'll have nothing. I'll have the file, which is already in federal intake and can't be suppressed. She was already moving toward the door. And I'll have the fact that there are now 3 journalists, not 1. I sent it to 2 others at 11:48 as contingency. Dana Marsh at the Tribune and 2 more at institutions with different editorial structures. One of them is outside Chicago entirely. He stared at her. "When?" "While you were in the hallway with Marcus." She said it without apology, without pause. "I built contingencies. That's what 7 months of this does to a person. You build contingencies." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he said, "Marcus comes. Marcus comes. And Reyes has everything he needs to transmit the Whitmore documentation to the federal office the moment I give him the signal. If anything goes wrong inside that building, I know. Celine." She turned. "He moved your brother tonight without authorization, in front of witnesses, on falsified administrative pretext. That's not a man executing a plan. That's a man who panicked." He watched her process this. Panicked men make mistakes. She looked at him for a beat. "Then let's go find his," she said. Mercy West Hospital was 12 minutes from St. Callaway at that hour. Damien drove. Marcus rode in the back, on his phone in a low, continuous conversation with Reyes that Damien could hear but not fully follow. Names, numbers, access credentials, the technical vocabulary of people who worked in the infrastructure of information. Celine sat in the passenger seat with her phone dark in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead, and her hands loose, not tense. The specific looseness of someone who has passed through the zone of maximum tension into something on the other side of it. "The journalist," Damien said. "The one outside Chicago. Boston Globe. Her name is Rachel Cho. She covered the Whitmore Committee for 2 years during his tenure. She has institutional knowledge and source relationships that Dana Marsh doesn't have." Celine kept her eyes on the road. "When I found the consortium connection and the first transaction date, I started thinking about who would know what Whitmore's committee had done with the regulatory framework. Rachel Cho wrote a piece in 2020 about consortium hospital structures and the regulatory gaps created by the 2019 reforms. She almost had it then. She just didn't have the internal documentation. You gave her the Whitmore calendar notation. I gave her everything. All 3 journalists received the complete file." She paused. "Dana Marsh is the Chicago story. Julian, the foundation, Ethan, Mia. Rachel Cho is the national story. The congressman, the consortium, the regulatory architecture." Another pause. "The 3rd journalist is at the Chicago Defender, Healthcare Equity Beat. The story from her angle is Mia. What happened to Mia and to every patient on that list who didn't have the right donor connection? 3 stories, 3 angles, 3 editorial institutions. Each one a different dimension of the same infrastructure, each one requiring a different response to suppress, none of them suppressible by the same mechanism." Damien drove. He thought about what he was walking into. A hospital controlled by a man connected to Whitmore at midnight, carrying no institutional authority, with a woman Julian Mercer had spent 2 years systematically dismantling, walking beside him. He had Marcus and he had Reyes at a remote terminal, and he had the knowledge that the files were already in systems Julian couldn't reach. What he did not have was the 16-year-old boy, and until he had the 16-year-old boy, nothing else was resolved. "Ethan's medication," he said. "What does he take?" 2 cardiac medications on a scheduled administration. The evening dose would have been at 10. If they moved him before 10, he may have missed it. She said this with the flatness of someone who had already run the calculation and had decided not to let herself feel the specific weight of it until she had more information. It won't cause an acute event if it's 1 dose. But if they're planning to hold him, they're not planning to hold him past tonight. Whatever Julian is doing, he's doing it to create a negotiating position, not a custody situation. He doesn't want a kidnapping charge on top of everything else. He already has worse than a kidnapping charge. He doesn't know that yet. She was quiet for a moment. He will, when the Tribune story runs. When does it run? Dana Marsh said she needed 2 hours to verify and get editorial approval. I sent it to her at 11:48. She looked at the dashboard clock. 12:17. She has 29 minutes left if she runs it at 2. 29 minutes. Damien pulled into the Mercy West parking structure. The Mercy West lobby at 12:21 a.m. had the specific quality of late-night institutional space, the lighting slightly too bright, the sound slightly too present, a handful of people in waiting chairs with the particular stillness of those who had been there long enough to stop checking their phones, a security desk staffed by 1 guard, a corridor map behind him on the wall. Julian was standing near the elevator bank. He had changed out of the gala suit. He was in a dress shirt now, no jacket, the shirt slightly open at the collar, and he looked like a version of himself that had been under pressure long enough to show it in small ways. The set of the jaw, the stillness that was effort rather than ease. He held a tablet loosely in his right hand. He looked at Damien. "I said Celine," he said. "She's here," Damien said. Celine came through the entrance doors behind him and stopped 3 feet to his left, and Julian's eyes moved to her with the specific quality of attention he'd had at the gala. The assessing, proprietary quality of a man checking on something he believed he owned. "You look tired," he said to her. She said nothing. "The care team has Ethan in a comfortable room on the 3rd floor. His monitors are running clean. He's sleeping." Julian's voice was the measured, clinical voice, the one designed for anxious families in hallways, the one that communicated competence and control in equal measure. "I want you to see him. That's the first thing. I want you to walk up to the 3rd floor and see that he's comfortable and safe, and then I want us to sit down and have a real conversation." "We can have the conversation here," Celine said. "I'd prefer privacy. I'd prefer my brother in his room at St. Callaway." Julian looked at her for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted. The clinical voice dropped away like a coat being shrugged off. And what was underneath was not the anger she'd seen in the corridor at the gala, not the cold calculation of the stairwell call. It was something more worn than either. Something that might, in a different context, on a different face, have registered as something close to real. "I know how this looks," he said. "I know exactly how it looks. I made decisions tonight that I made because I was trying to protect something." He paused. I'm not asking you to believe my intentions were good. I'm asking you to understand that the people I work with have interests that extend significantly beyond what you've documented. If you push the file the way you're planning to push it, you will be visible to those people in a way that I cannot manage." "You're describing a threat," Damien said. "I'm describing reality." Julian looked at him. "You found the secondary address. You found the ownership structure. You're very close to a name that connects to people who are significantly more dangerous than I am, and I'm asking you to understand that before you push a button, you can't unpush." "Whitmore," Damien said. Julian's face went through something fast and controlled and landed on stillness. "Don't say that name in this building." "Carl Whitmore, former congressman, beneficial owner of the trust that capitalized the consortium expansion." Damien kept his voice even. We have the documentation. It's already in federal intake. The tablet in Julian's hand came very close to dropping. He caught it with the reflex of a man who didn't want the tell, but the reflex came a fraction of a second late, and the fraction was visible. You have a calendar notation, Julian said. His voice was different now. A lunch meeting. That's not documentation. The calendar notation is one piece. Damien watched Julian's face carefully. The ownership structure documentation is another. The testimony of 3 hospital staff members whose complaints were buried by an HR process you controlled is another. And the patient records for 14 months of transplant priority manipulation are the foundation of all of it. He paused. It's in federal intake. It's in state board review. And it's in the hands of 3 journalists at 3 separate institutions, one of whom covered the Whitmore Committee for 2 years and has been waiting for this specific documentation for 4. Julian looked at Celine. She looked back. You did this tonight, he said. You routed everything tonight. The intake was confirmed at 11:06, she said. Before you moved Ethan, before your call to whoever you called. It was already done. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when a man processed the full weight of information that restructured every calculation he'd made in the previous 3 hours. Damien watched Julian do the processing, watched him work through the federal intake, the state board review, the journalist, the Whitmore documentation, and watched the specific moment when the processing reached its conclusion. Julian moved. Not toward Celine, not toward Damien. He stepped sideways toward the corridor, the specific movement of a man who needed to make a call he couldn't make in front of witnesses. And Damien moved simultaneously, not to stop him, but to cut the angle, to position himself between Julian and the corridor with the geometry of someone who had spent enough years in difficult physical situations to understand spatial control. Don't, Damien said. Julian stopped. Whatever call you're about to make, Damien said, understand that making it confirms the connection we've documented. The call logs will be subpoenaed. The number will identify the recipient. The timestamp will place it after the federal intake confirmation, which means it's not coordination, it's obstruction. Julian looked at him. You're not a criminal lawyer, he said. I know enough. You know enough. Something moved through Julian's face that was harder than calculation and rawer than the performed versions of himself. You've been in this for 6 hours and you think you know enough. You have no idea what you've put in motion. The people above Whitmore. There are people above Whitmore, Damien said. Julian stopped himself. The silence had a different quality now. Damien felt it. The specific alteration of atmosphere in a space when something true has been accidentally confirmed. Julian had said the people above Whitmore. Not Whitmore's associates, not Whitmore's network. Above. Whitmore wasn't the top. Damien filed this without letting it show on his face. I want to see Ethan, Celine said. Her voice cut through the silence with the clean precision of someone who had been holding a specific purpose in both hands for the entire conversation and was done waiting to use it. Now, take me to the 3rd floor. Julian looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at Damien, and then he looked at the lobby. The security guard at the desk, Marcus standing near the entrance, the handful of waiting room people who had not looked up once during this entire conversation because late-night hospital lobbies contained enough tension in their normal operation that 3 more people talking quietly near the elevators registered as nothing unusual. 3rd floor, he said. The elevator held the 4 of them, Julian, Celine, Damien, and a silence that had the specific weight of everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Damien watched Julian in the elevator's reflective door. Julian watched the floor numbers. Celine watched nothing, her eyes slightly unfocused, running something internal he couldn't read. The doors opened on 3. The pediatric cardiac floor at Mercy West had the same quality as St. Callaway at this hour. The muted light, the soft mechanical percussion of monitoring equipment, the specific institutional smell of a place where difficult things happened with practiced calm. A nursing station to the left. 3 doors visible in the corridor ahead. A man was standing at the nursing station. Not a nurse. Not a doctor. A man in his 50s in a dark suit jacket over a collared shirt, the specific attire of someone who occupied administrative or executive space rather than clinical space, with the build of someone who had been physically capable once and still carried the memory of it in his posture. He was talking to the charge nurse in a low voice, and when the elevator opened, he turned and looked at the group with the alert, assessing attention of someone who had been waiting for them. Julian said, "Harlan." Harlan Goss. Damien had known the name for less than an hour. He looked at the face now. The CAO of Mercy West, the man whose consortium credentials had reached across institutional lines to change Ethan's attending assignment, the man whose name sat beside Whitmore's in the trust documentation, and assessed what he was looking at. Goss was the infrastructure, not the face, not the surgeon with the award and the cameras, but the person who made the system work, who knew where the administrative levers were and how hard to pull them, and who could be called at midnight and would show up in a suit. "Mr. Voss," Goss said. He said it the way people said a name they'd looked up in the last hour. "This is a clinical facility. I'm going to need you and your associate to wait in the lobby while Dr. Mercer and Ms. Carter—" "No," Damien said. Goss looked at him. "This isn't a request." "I know it's not, but Ethan Carter is a minor. Celine Carter is his legal guardian of record, and I am accompanying his legal guardian in a facility where an unauthorized transfer was executed tonight using falsified administrative pretext." He held Goss's gaze. "If you'd like to discuss the parameters of my presence, I'd suggest we do it with your legal team and mine on a conference call that will take approximately 45 minutes to arrange, during which time neither Ethan nor Celine goes anywhere." He paused. "Or we go see the boy and sort the rest out after." Goss looked at Julian. Julian said nothing. Goss stepped back from the nursing station. Room 312. Ethan Carter was awake. That was the first thing. He was awake, sitting up at approximately a 45-degree angle with the specific alertness of someone who had not been asleep for any of the last hour, and when the door opened and Celine came through it, his face did something that Damien, standing in the doorway, had no name for and did not try to name. It was the face of a 16-year-old boy who had been very scared and was now looking at his sister, and the specific relief in it was not a thing that required interpretation. "Hey," Ethan said. His voice was rougher than expected, slightly hoarse. "Hey," Celine said. She crossed the room in 4 steps and sat on the edge of his bed and put her hand on the side of his face, the way people did when they needed to confirm something real with their hands. And Ethan let her, which was the thing about 16-year-old boys. They didn't let people do that unless they needed it. "Are you okay?" she said. "They said it was a routine transfer." His eyes moved past her to Damien in the doorway, then to Julian, then back to Celine. "It didn't feel routine." "It wasn't." "What's happening?" "A lot." She took her hand down. "Are you okay? Medically? Did you get your evening medication?" "They gave me something when I got here. I don't know if it was the right thing." He looked at the IV line in his arm. "The nurse said it was fine, but she said it fast, the way people say things fast when they're not sure." Celine looked at the IV line. Then she looked at Julian, who was standing at the door beside Damien. "What is he on?" she said. "Standard cardiac maintenance protocol," Julian said. "Same as St. Callaway." He said the nurse gave him something when he arrived. "What specifically?" "I would need to check the administration record." "Then check it." Julian looked at the tablet in his hand, looked at it for a moment too long. "Julian?" Her voice was flat and absolute. "What did they give him?" "A sedative," Julian said. "A mild one." Ethan was distressed during the transfer, and the admitting nurse made a clinical judgment. "You sedated him." The nurse made a clinical. "He's a cardiac patient, and someone gave him an unscheduled sedative without family authorization and without noting the contraindication flag that has been in his chart since admission." She stood up from the bed, and the thing that Damien had watched building in her all evening, the frequency below the surface, the thing she'd been managing with everything she had since the moment he'd opened the wrong door, was no longer below anything. That flag exists because his cardiac medication has a documented interaction with 2 classes of sedative, and you know that because you are the physician who added it to his chart 14 months ago. The room was completely still. The interaction is minor, Julian said. The interaction is documented, Celine said. In his chart, which you accessed tonight, which means you knew. Julian said nothing. He knew, Ethan said. His voice was quiet, but it was not shaking. He was looking at Julian with the specific, clear attention of a 16-year-old who had been scared and confused and was now rapidly becoming something else. He knew, and he let them give it to me anyway. Ethan, Julian started. Don't. Ethan's voice was still quiet, but it had an edge in it now that hadn't been there a moment ago. The edge of someone who had been processing things alone in a hospital room for the last 2 hours and had arrived at conclusions he hadn't wanted to arrive at. I heard you in the hallway when they were moving me. I wasn't fully asleep yet. You were on the phone and you said... He stopped, looked at his sister. You said, she'll come. Who were you talking about? Julian looked at Ethan. Damien watched Julian look at Ethan, a 16-year-old boy in a hospital bed who had just repeated his own words back to him, and watched something happen in Julian's face that he had not seen there before. Not the controlled performance, not the calculation. Something that looked almost like shame, and then something that extinguished the shame and replaced it with the colder thing, the thing that had always been underneath. I need everyone except Celine to step outside, Julian said. No, Damien said. This is a private family. It's not a family conversation. Damien came fully into the room and let the door close behind him. You used a child's medical care as leverage over his sister. You moved him tonight to a facility where your administrative allies have system-level access. You authorized or permitted an unscheduled sedative despite a documented contraindication flag. And you are standing in this room trying to get the witnesses out. He kept his voice completely level. I'm not leaving this room. Julian looked at him. There was a moment, 3 or 4 seconds, that had a quality Damien recognized from specific other moments in his life. The moment before a situation changed register entirely. Before whatever had been held in check stopped being held. He could feel it in the quality of the silence and in the specific way Julian was standing and in his own heartbeat, which had not changed pace but had sharpened in register, the way it did when his body was running an assessment below the level of conscious thought. Julian moved toward Celine, not aggressive, not a lunge, not a strike, but the movement of a man crossing a room to take hold of a situation physically, the specific movement of someone who had spent years using proximity and size as a tool of management. And Damien was between him and Celine before he covered half the distance, not blocking him, but occupying the space in a way that required Julian to either stop or make a different choice. Julian stopped. They were close enough that Damien could hear him breathing. You don't want to do this, Damien said quietly. Not a warning, an observation. You're in my way. Julian's voice was barely above a conversational register, the deliberate quietness of a man who did not want to be heard from outside the room. I know. Move. No. 3 seconds. 4. Then Julian's right hand came up and hit Damien's left shoulder with the flat-handed force of a shove, and Damien took 1 step back to manage the force and came back to where he'd been. And in the bed behind him he heard Ethan make a sharp sound and heard Celine say his name. Not Julian's, Damien's, in a voice he had never heard from her before. Julian's face had gone past controlled, past calculated. He was breathing faster now, and the composure that had served him through a charity gala and a confrontation in a corridor and a midnight negotiation in a hospital lobby was genuinely, visibly fracturing at its edges. 3 journalists have the file, Damien said. His voice was completely steady. Federal intake was confirmed at 11:06. The state board has been notified. Dr. Yuen has a documented verbal preliminary suspension of your attending authority at St. Callaway. And Reyes... He paused just long enough. Reyes is transmitting the Whitmore documentation to the Federal Oversight Office in 11 minutes on a timer, regardless of whether I contact him. Julian stared at him. That last part isn't true, Damien said. But you don't know that. The fracturing spread. It's done, Celine said from behind Damien. Her voice was absolute. Whatever you're trying to hold together tonight, It's done. The question is whether you walk out of this room or whether Ethan and I walk out and you stay and explain the sedative and the unauthorized transfer and the falsified administrative order to the people who are going to be here very shortly. Julian looked at her, past Damien, around him, at her. And what was in his face now was the thing that had always been underneath the performance, but that neither cameras nor witnesses nor the city's collective belief in him had ever required him to show. "You destroyed everything," he said. His voice was low and very specific. "You built something that deserved to be destroyed," she said. Something in the room shifted. Not physically. Nothing moved. No one stepped. But the register changed in the way that registers change when a thing has been said that can't be unsaid, when the last veneer of possible resolution has been stripped, and what remains is just the architecture of what actually happened. Julian reached past Damien, not a shove this time, a grab, his hand closing on Celine's arm with the speed of a man who had made a decision he was no longer calculating, and Damien had his wrist before Celine could react, the specific grip of someone who had learned to control a wrist before the force in it fully transmitted, and Julian turned with the instinctive response of a man fighting the control, and they were in contact now, genuinely in contact. And behind them, Ethan was on his feet despite the IV line. 16 years old, cardiac condition, on his feet in a hospital room because his sister— "Stop," Damien said. Not to Julian, to Ethan. Ethan stopped. Julian was breathing hard, his wrist in Damien's grip, and Damien held the grip without increasing the pressure, held it at exactly the level required to maintain control without causing injury, and looked at Julian Mercer's face from close enough to see the sweat along his hairline and the specific dilation of eyes under adrenaline, and he thought about Celine's back in the dressing room and the bruise along her lower back and the practiced flatness of "I fell," and he kept his grip exactly where it was. "There are 3 people in this room who can testify to what just happened," Damien said. "There is a nurse at the station who heard enough of the last 10 minutes to place statements in an incident report. There's documentation of an unauthorized transfer, a sedative administered against a contraindication flag, and physical contact with a witness in the presence of 2 other witnesses." He kept his voice below conversational. "And the journalists have the file. Whatever happens in this room, the file is already outside your reach." Julian was still. "Let go of his wrist," Celine said. She was talking to Damien. He looked at her. She was looking at Julian with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not the armor, not the professional neutrality, not the carefully managed blankness she'd deployed against everything Julian had thrown at her. Something that was simply and directly itself, without management, without calibration. "Let go," she said again. Damien released Julian's wrist. Julian stepped back. He stood against the far wall of the room with his wrist cradled against his chest and his breathing audible, and his face doing something that was genuinely unfamiliar to it. The face of a man in a small room where every exit he had spent years constructing was closed, and where the witnesses and the documentation and the arithmetic of what he'd done were finally in the same space as the thing itself. Celine looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Ethan and said, "Can you walk?" "Yeah." Ethan's voice was slightly unsteady, but his feet were solid. "Yeah, I can walk. The IV. I'll take it out." "You can't take out your own, Celine." He looked at her with the specific patience of a younger sibling who had spent years watching an older sibling manage everything. "I've watched nurses do it 6 times. I can take it out." She looked at him for a beat. Then she looked at Damien. He moved to the door. He opened it and stepped into the corridor and said to Marcus, who was 15 feet down the hall, "Get the car." And then, because the night had one more move in it, Damien turned back into the doorway to look at Julian Mercer one last time. At the man against the wall, at the fracture lines visible in every surface of the performance he'd built, and said, very quietly, so that only Julian could hear it, "Whoever is above Whitmore, whoever you're afraid of. They're going to know by morning that you lost the file and the documentation and the boy and the attending authority and the administrative cover, and they're going to make a decision about what to do with a face that's no longer useful." He paused. "The only offer that protects you is from the federal investigators. Not from me, not from anyone else. Call your lawyer and tell them to contact the Federal Health Oversight Office before the Tribune story runs. He checked his watch. 12:41. You have 19 minutes. He didn't wait to see what Julian did with the 19 minutes. He walked down the corridor to where Marcus was already at the elevator with his phone against his ear, and behind him he heard the room he'd left. The specific quality of a silence that was no longer strategic or managed, but simply the silence of a space where everything had. The car was warm. That was the first thing Celine noticed when she got in. The specific warmth of a heated interior on a cold Chicago night. The kind of warmth that felt deliberate rather than incidental. And she sat in the back seat beside Ethan with his shoulder against hers and his IV-free arm resting across his knees, and she did not say anything for the first 4 minutes of the drive back across the city. Ethan didn't say anything either. He was looking out the window at Chicago moving past, the late-night geometry of it, the lights and the dark water glimpsed between buildings, and the indifferent forward motion of a city that did not reorganize itself around private catastrophes. And his breathing was even, and his color was better than it had been in the hospital room, the sedative working its way out of his system in the gradual way that mild sedatives did, leaving behind a clarity that was slightly raw at the edges. Marcus drove. Damien sat in the passenger seat with his phone in his hand and did not look at it. At the 4th minute, Ethan said, "How long?" Celine looked at him. "How long has it been like that?" he said. He was still looking out the window. With Julian. She was quiet for a moment. "A while," she said. "How long is a while?" "Ethan, I'm not a kid." He turned from the window then and looked at her directly, and what was in his face was not the hurt of someone who had just learned a difficult thing, but the specific expression of someone who had suspected a difficult thing for a long time and was now having the suspicion confirmed. "I've known something was wrong for months. I didn't know what. I thought maybe it was the stress of the engagement, or work, or—" He stopped. "I thought a lot of things that were easier than the real thing." "I know. Did you stay because of me?" He said it flatly, without accusation, the way someone asked a question they had already worked out the answer to and needed to hear spoken aloud anyway. She looked at him for a long moment, at his face, the face of her brother, 16 years old, thinner than he should be, sitting in the back of a car at 1 a.m. with a hospital bracelet still on his wrist. And she thought about what a lie would cost and what the truth would cost and decided that she was done with the specific math of that calculation. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, the small absorptive nod of someone integrating information they'd known was coming. "That's done now," she said. "I know." He looked back out the window. "I heard what he said in the room about the journalists, about the federal—" He paused. "Is Ethan safe? I mean—" He caught himself and made a sound that was almost a short, exhausted breath of a laugh. "Is I safe? That's weird to say." "You're safe," she said. "From the medical thing, the list thing. Dr. Yuen is your specialist of record. Julian's attending authority has been suspended pending review. By the time the review concludes, the federal process will have replaced the need for it entirely." She said it the way she said the things she knew with absolute certainty. "You're on Dr. Yuen's service. She's good. She has no connection to any of this." He was quiet for a moment. "What happens to him?" he said. She didn't answer immediately. "Julian," he said, as if she might have meant someone else. "The federal review takes the lead. The state medical board will move for emergency suspension of his license once the intake documentation is processed, which happens during business hours today." She paused. "The journalists publish. The public record is created. After that, the legal process runs the way legal processes run. And the other people, the congressman, the hospital guy, those are longer processes." She looked at her hands in her lap. Longer and harder and less certain. But the thread exists now. The documentation is in the right hands. That's not nothing. "It's not everything either." "No," she said. "It's not everything." The car was quiet for a moment, the city moving past. "Celine," Ethan said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you didn't stay quiet." He said it to the window, not to her face, the way 16-year-olds said the most important things. I know what you thought you were protecting. I want you to know it wasn't worth it. Whatever happens to the list, whatever happens to my case, it wasn't worth it." She did not have anything to say to that. She put her hand over his on the seat between them. He turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything else for the rest of the drive. But at 2:14 a.m., Dana Marsh's piece went live on the Tribune's website. Damien read it in the lobby of St. Callaway while Celine got Ethan settled back into his room. The real room, the right bed, the correct chart, with a night nurse named Pilar, who moved with the efficient, unhurried competence of someone who had been waiting for this specific outcome and was quietly pleased by it. The piece was good. It was careful and documented, and it named names with the specific precision of someone who had spent 2 hours verifying against source material and had not published anything she couldn't support. Julian's name was in the first paragraph. The foundation's donor payment structure was in the third. Mia's case, unnamed, anonymized per protocol, but described with the specific detail that made it real, was in the sixth. The word Whitmore did not appear. That was Rachel Cho's piece. That ran at 4:17 a.m., Boston time, and Damien read it in the parking structure while Marcus sat on the hood of the car and drank coffee from a machine that had no business producing coffee that tasted as good as it did. Rachel Cho's piece was different in register, longer, more structural, the specific architecture of a story that had been partially built for years and had just received the foundation it needed. Whitmore was in the second paragraph. The consortium expansion was in the fourth. The regulatory gaps created by his committee work were detailed across 3 paragraphs in the middle of the piece with the particular clarity of someone who understood the mechanism and had been waiting for the evidence. At the bottom of Rachel Cho's piece, a one-line note. Federal investigators confirmed receipt of documentation related to the allegations in this story at 11:06 p.m. Thursday. Damien closed his phone. He looked at the parking structure ceiling, the concrete, the pipes, the institutional permanence of it, and thought about Julian Mercer standing against the wall in room 312, with his wrist at his chest and the fracture lines visible in every surface. And he thought about 19 minutes and whether Julian had used them. He found out at 9:47 that morning when Reyes sent a single line. Mercer's lawyer contacted federal oversight at 1:02 a.m., cooperation agreement being discussed. 1 a.m. 19 minutes after Damien had walked out of the room. He had used them. Band. 3 weeks passed the way the aftermath of difficult things passed, not quickly and not smoothly, but with the specific forward motion of processes that had been set in motion and were now running on their own momentum. The state medical board suspended Julian's license on the 4th day. The suspension was temporary pending the full review, but temporary suspensions in the presence of federal cooperation agreements had a documented pattern of becoming permanent, and the people who knew how these things went knew how this one was going. Harlan Goss resigned as CAO of Mercy West on the 7th day. The resignation letter cited personal reasons. The federal investigators did not comment publicly on whether the resignation was connected to their ongoing review. The people who knew how these things went knew how this one was going too. Carl Whitmore issued a statement through his attorney on the 9th day. The statement denied knowledge of the foundation's operations and characterized his involvement with the consortium expansion as routine legislative work. Rachel Cho published a response piece on the 10th day that was 11 paragraphs long and contained 17 footnotes. The statement was not repeated. Ethan Carter was placed on Dr. Yuen's active service on the 2nd day. His priority placement was reviewed by an independent clinical panel with no connection to the foundation, the consortium, or any of Julian's board relationships. The panel's assessment placed him 2nd on the active list. Dr. Yuen told Celine on the 14th day that they were looking at a probable surgical window within 6 to 8 weeks. Celine said thank you in the specific flat voice she used when she meant something so completely that no other register could contain it. Doctor. Yuen said, "You did the work. I just showed up at the end." Celine said nothing to that. Look, on the 21st day, she went back to the office. Not because she had to. Damien had placed a resignation letter on her desk on the 1st day, unsigned, with a note that said only, Your decision, no conditions. She had read it and left it where it was, and taken 3 weeks of the accumulated leave she had never used because there had never been a reason to use it that felt more important than being present and functional and capable. And in those 3 weeks, she had done a specific series of things that she had not been able to do for 14 months. She slept without listening for sounds. She ate meals at the time she was actually hungry rather than at the times Julian expected them. She sat in her apartment on the second night and went through every drawer and every shelf and every corner where the evidence of a particular version of her life had accumulated. And she filled 2 boxes and carried them to the building's donation drop without ceremony and without hesitation and without the specific grief she had expected to feel, which turned out not to be the grief she'd expected at all, but something smaller and more manageable. The grief of time lost rather than of love lost, which was a different and less permanent wound. On the 14th day, she called her mother, who lived in St. Louis and who knew something had been wrong for a year without knowing what. And she told her the truth in the straightforward way she'd been telling truth to people lately, without the management and the calibration and the careful construction of the version that protected everyone else from the full weight of it. Her mother was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then she said, "Should have asked more." "You asked," Celine said. "I didn't answer. I should have pushed. I wouldn't have let you." She paused. "That's on me." Her mother came to Chicago on the 16th day and stayed for 5, and they did not talk about Julian very much, which was right. They talked about Ethan, and about what came next, and about a restaurant her mother had read about in the Tribune's weekend section, and they went there on the 4th night, and the food was good, and the table was by a window that looked out onto the street, and Celine sat in her chair with her back to the wall, because she still did that, still felt the reflex of it, and recognized the reflex for what it was, and allowed it without judgment. It would take longer than 3 weeks to stop doing that. She knew this. She was a practical person. Iant. On the 21st day, she pushed open the door to Blackwood International's 43rd floor and walked past the reception desk and down the corridor to her own desk and sat down. The resignation letter was where she'd left it. Unsigned, undated. Sitting in the center of the desk with the patient neutrality of a document that had been placed without expectation and left without pressure. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned on her computer, pulled up her calendar, and found 3 items that had accumulated in her absence that required her specific knowledge to address. She addressed them. She replied to 2 emails that had been waiting in a holding pattern and filed 4 that didn't require response. She made a note in the margin of the Harrington account file about a follow-up call that needed to happen before the end of the month. She was halfway through the 3rd calendar item when she heard the door at the end of the corridor. She did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was reading, made the note she needed to make, and then looked up. Damien was standing in the doorway of his office. Not in the doorway, at the threshold, which was a different thing. He was looking at her with the expression she had come to know over 11 months as his resting assessment expression, the one that revealed nothing except that he was paying attention. The resignation letter was between them on the desk. He looked at it. She looked at him. "I didn't sign it," she said. "I see that. I'm not going to." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. She turned back to her screen. He didn't move from the threshold immediately. She could feel him there, the specific quality of his presence, which she had spent 11 months registering and managing and keeping at the appropriate professional distance, and she let herself feel it without managing it for exactly 3 seconds, which was new, and then she went back to the calendar item. "There are 2 calls this morning," she said, without looking up. "The Harrington follow-up and one with the legal team about the Reyes situation. I've put them both at 10. "That works," he said. "Also," she paused, "the document you asked Marcus to retrieve from the gala prep suite the night of the event, the Harrington folder. It's still on your desk. I noticed when I came in." A beat. "I'll get it," he said. "I already filed it," she said. "It was 3 weeks late." Another beat, slightly longer. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once, the small professional nod that meant acknowledged and processed and moving forward, and she heard him step back from the threshold and move into his office, and the door did not close fully. It rested at the angle it rested at every morning, The 2 or 3 inches of open space that she had spent 11 months understanding meant he was available without requiring announcement. She looked at her screen. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago was doing what Chicago did, moving forward with the specific indifference of a city that had been through enough to know that the things that happened inside its buildings, however significant they were to the people inside them, were small against the scale of its own continuing motion. The lake was gray-blue in the morning light. There was a low cloud cover that would probably burn off by noon. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Carter was in a hospital room being monitored by a cardiologist who was not afraid of him and who had placed him second on a list managed by people who made their decisions on clinical grounds. Celine picked up her coffee. It was good coffee. She had stopped at the place on Michigan Avenue that she'd been walking past for 11 months without allowing herself the 15-minute detour, because 15 minutes had always felt like something she couldn't spare. And this morning it had not felt that way. She took a sip. She set it down. She went back to work. Not because she owed it, not because she was afraid of what happened if she didn't, not because someone had arranged the terms of her presence in a way that made departure feel dangerous or disloyal, or like a loss she couldn't afford. She went back to work because this was the life she was choosing, and the difference between a chosen life and an endured one was not always visible from the outside, but was absolute from the inside, and she was done with the kind of math that made endurance feel like the only option. The morning moved forward the way mornings did. Down the corridor, through the open door, she heard the sound of Damien settling into his chair. The specific sound of a large man in a well-made chair, the small, unhurried adjustment of someone who had nowhere to be except where he was. She had heard that sound every morning for 11 months. It had never meant what it meant now. She did not examine what it meant. Not yet. There was time for that. Real time, uncontracted time. Time that belonged to her in the most absolute sense because she had paid for it in the hardest currency available, and it was hers now, and it was not going anywhere. She pulled up the next file. Outside, the clouds began to thin. By noon, it would be clear. End.